The San Diego sky that evening was painted with warm hues of orange and purple as the setting sun cast long streaks of light across towering buildings. The last golden rays reflected off car windows, creating fleeting patterns of light and shadow on the dashboard of Aubrey's car. He had just left an intense meeting at the police department. Driving slowly toward home, Aubrey let his mind drift, trying to stretch out a moment of peace before confronting the heavy thoughts waiting for him. The soft hum of jazz from the radio was a feeble attempt to ease the exhaustion and loneliness quietly creeping into his heart. Case files on internal misconduct, unresolved investigations, and silent resistance from colleagues weighed on him like an invisible burden. Approaching an intersection, the traffic light turned from yellow to red, and Aubrey brought his car to a smooth stop. He exhaled deeply, fingers tapping absently on the steering wheel. But just as he allowed himself a fleeting pause, the sudden flash of red and blue lights erupted behind him, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren, shattering his brief moment of stillness. Aubrey's brows furrowed slightly as he glanced in the rearview mirror. A patrol car was pulling up fast, its lights strobing ominously against the fading daylight. He pulled over calmly, lowering his window with steady hands. Officer Ryder approached with confident strides, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the last slivers of the sun. His hand rested lightly on the edge of his duty belt, a subtle display of authority. "Licensed and registration. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Ryder's voice was curt, lacking any hint of courtesy. Aubrey nodded slightly, reaching into the glove compartment without haste. He handed over his documents, his face composed but his eyes sharp. A faint tension began to stir beneath his calm demeanor. He knew the procedure well, but Ryder's demeanor wasn't just about a traffic stop. It felt like something more, something personal. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Ryder pressed, his tone laced with subtle accusation. "Just heading home," Aubrey replied evenly, his voice steady yet polite. Ryder glanced at the license, then back at Aubrey, his gaze narrowing slightly. "You're not from around here, are you?" Aubrey gave a slight smile, more out of politeness than amusement. "Moved to San Diego a few months ago. My address is right there." But Ryder wasn't really listening. His questions became sharper, filled with an undercurrent of unspoken judgment, as if he was searching for a reason beyond the supposed traffic violation. Aubrey felt the shift, the subtle tightening of the atmosphere. Not fear, but a familiar frustration. As the last light of day faded, Aubrey knew deep down, this wasn't just an ordinary stop. This was the beginning of something bigger. The calmness of the evening quickly dissolved into an oppressive tension. The once vibrant sunset had faded into muted shades of gray, casting long, dark shadows over the empty streets. Aubrey stood next to his car, his posture composed, but beneath the surface, a swirl of conflicting emotions brewed. Frustration, disappointment, and an underlying sense of injustice. Officer Ryder wasn't done. He stepped closer, his authoritative tone sharp as he barked out a new command. "Step out of the car. Place your hands on the hood." Aubrey took a slow breath, suppressing the rising anger inside. This wasn't just about a routine stop anymore. It was a blatant display of power and control, wrapped in the thin veil of procedure. Despite the growing tension, Aubrey kept his voice steady, his words carefully measured. "Is there a specific reason for this, officer?" Ryder smirked slightly, his arrogance seeping through every word. "Just a routine check. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be, do you?" It wasn't a request, it was a challenge. Aubrey clenched his jaw briefly, but remained outwardly calm. He stepped out of the car slowly, deliberately, and placed his hands on the cold metal of the car's hood. The steel felt like a metaphor. Cold, unyielding, indifferent. Ryder's hands moved over Aubrey in a rough, unnecessary pat-down. It wasn't about safety, it was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction. But Aubrey didn't flinch, he didn't shift. His calm, defiant stillness was more unsettling to Ryder than any resistance could have been. When the search yielded nothing, Ryder took a step back, clearly irritated. His pride wounded, he reached for another angle, trying to regain control. You seem pretty confident. You've dealt with cops before, haven't you? Aubrey turned his head slightly, meeting Ryder's eyes with an unwavering gaze. I understand that real authority doesn't come from how loudly you speak or how hard you press. It comes from knowing when you don't need to. The words hit Ryder like a slap. Subtle but undeniable, his jaw tightened, and for a brief moment his composed facade cracked. Taking a step forward, Ryder's voice dropped into a low, confrontational growl. You think you're smarter than me? Aubrey didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his voice calm yet sharp as a blade. I think it's dangerous when someone with power feels threatened by respect. The tension was suffocating. The street around them was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding under the dimming sky. Ryder's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, his fingers twitching near his belt, a silent gesture of frustration and failed control. But before Ryder could escalate the situation further, Aubrey slowly reached into his pocket, moving with deliberate clarity. I'm reaching for my badge, no sudden moves, officer. Ryder stiffened, his eyes narrowing, but curiosity edged out aggression. Aubrey pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge. Aubrey, he said quietly, his voice steady as steel. Director of Internal Affairs, San Diego Police Department. The color drained from Ryder's face. His arrogant smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of shock, fear, and disbelief. The man he had been trying to intimidate now stood before him as the person with the authority to decide his future. Aubrey's next words were low but carried the weight of undeniable truth. You just crossed a line you can't uncross. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted, not with threats, not with force, but with the simple revelation of who truly held the real authority. The morning after the confrontation, the sky over San Diego was heavy with thick gray clouds, as if reflecting the weight of what was to come. Aubrey sat alone in his office, the sterile glow of fluorescent lights casting cold reflections on the polished surface of his desk. Scattered across it were files, documents detailing misconduct, disciplinary reports, and, front and center, the dossier on Officer Ryder. But this wasn't just about Ryder. The pages told a larger story. A pattern of complaints dismissed, investigations quietly buried, and behaviors excused under the pretense of handling things internally. Ryder wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of a system that had grown too comfortable with silence. Aubrey's jaw clenched as he flipped through the reports. The frustration wasn't just professional, it was personal. This was the very culture he had dedicated his career to dismantling, and yet here it was, thriving in the shadows of bureaucracy and denial. Determined, he grabbed the file and headed to the office of Chief Devlin, a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper instinct to maintain the department's public image at all costs. Devlin was the kind of leader who believed in keeping things in-house, favoring quiet resolutions over public accountability. Aubrey knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. Devlin looked up from his desk, raising an eyebrow at the unannounced intrusion. April, I need to talk about Officer Ryder, Aubrey said, his tone leaving no room for small talk. Devlin leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I've seen the report. It's nothing we haven't handled before. A few bad decisions, but nothing that requires making a spectacle. We'll deal with it quietly, like we always do. Those words were like gasoline poured onto the fire already burning inside Aubrey. He stepped forward, slamming the file onto Devlin's desk with a sharp thud. And that's exactly the problem, Aubrey snapped. We've been handling it quietly for years. That's why people like Ryder think they can act with impunity, because no one ever holds them accountable, not really. Devlin's face hardened, his jaw tightening. Aubrey, we can't afford a scandal. The department's reputation. The department's reputation is already in shambles. Aubrey cut in, his voice rising, filled with the frustration of years spent battling a broken system. You think sweeping this under the rug protects us? It doesn't. It makes us complicit. Every time we look the other way, we're not protecting the badge, we're tarnishing it. The room fell into a tense silence. Devlin stared at Aubrey, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he exhaled, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away the uncomfortable truth settling between them. "You really think you can change all this with one report? One hearing?" Devlin muttered, his voice laced with both skepticism and something else. Maybe fear. Maybe resignation. Aubrey's reply was soft but carried the weight of conviction. No, but someone has to start." Devlin didn't respond immediately. He sat back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers in the sterile glow of the office lights. When he finally looked back at Aubrey, something had shifted. A crack in his otherwise stoic facade. Not full agreement, but perhaps the first flicker of acknowledgement. Aubrey left the office with his heart still racing. Walking down the long, dimly lit hallway, his footsteps echoed in the emptiness. A stark reminder that real change often feels lonely at first. But he didn't let that slow him down. Stepping outside, he paused for a moment, looking up at the overcast sky. The clouds above were thick and unyielding, but Aubrey knew that beyond them the sun was still there. Hidden for now, but constant. Just like the truth. No matter how long it's buried, it never disappears. The morning of the disciplinary hearing arrived under a sky blanketed with gray clouds, casting a somber mood over San Diego. The conference room inside the police headquarters was sterile and cold, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that reflected off the polished wooden table where Aubrey sat across from Officer Ryder. Ryder was a shadow of the confident, arrogant officer Aubrey had encountered during the traffic stop. Gone was the swagger, replaced by a stiff posture, tense jaw, and eyes that darted nervously around the room. His once proud uniform seemed to sag on his frame, as if even the fabric itself had surrendered under the weight of what was about to unfold. The room was filled with silent observers, fellow officers, internal affairs investigators, and department officials, all waiting to witness the consequences of actions long ignored. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on, but Aubrey remained composed. His face showed no trace of satisfaction. There was no victory in watching Ryder squirm. Instead, his heart was heavy with a quiet sadness, not for Ryder, but for the system that had allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. The hearing began, and one by one the evidence was laid out: misconduct reports, complaints from civilians, and footage from the infamous traffic stop. The details painted a clear picture, not just of Ryder's abuse of power, but of a culture that had enabled it. A culture that had turned a blind eye, brushed aside red flags, and prioritized the department's image over integrity. Ryder tried to defend himself, his voice shaky but still laced with defiance. "I was just doing my job. I followed protocol. I thought I was keeping the community safe." Aubrey's response was calm, but his words cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "Your job isn't to intimidate, harass, or judge based on your own biases. Your badge isn't a shield for your ego. It's a promise to serve with fairness and integrity. But the real problem isn't just what you did. It's that you never thought you were wrong, because the system never held you accountable." Ryder's face flushed, his jaw tightening, but he had no real rebuttal. The truth was undeniable. Then, something unexpected happened. Chief Devlin, who had remained silent for most of the proceedings, stood up. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Devlin, known for his stoic demeanor and resistance to public confrontation, cleared his throat. His eyes were heavy, not just with exhaustion, but with the weight of years spent looking the other way. "This isn't just about Officer Ryder," Devlin began, his voice rough but steady. "This is about all of us. About a department that's been more concerned with protecting its reputation than living up to the values we claim to represent. And I've been part of that problem." The admission hit harder than any accusation could have. It was rare, almost unheard of, for someone in Devlin's position to take public responsibility. But here he was, standing in front of his peers, stripping away the layers of denial that had protected the department's fragile facade for far too long. He turned to Aubrey, his expression softer, filled with a mixture of respect and regret. "You're right, Aubrey, we can't fix what we refuse to face. Change starts here." The hearing concluded with Ryder's suspension and the initiation of a broader investigation into systemic misconduct within the department. But Aubrey knew that the real victory wasn't in punishing Ryder, It was in breaking the silence, in forcing the department to confront the uncomfortable truth it had buried for years. Months later, at a public forum packed with community members, officers, and local leaders, Aubrey stood at the podium. This time, the spotlight didn't feel heavy, it felt necessary. He didn't rely on a prepared speech. Instead, he spoke from the heart, his voice resonating with conviction. Justice isn't just about holding individuals accountable. It's about creating systems where accountability is the norm, not the exception. True reform isn't easy, it's uncomfortable, it's messy, but it's necessary. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from the courage to say, "This isn't good enough." There was a brief pause, then applause, genuine and heartfelt, not just from the public but from fellow officers who, perhaps for the first time, truly understood the message. As Aubrey stepped down from the stage, he locked eyes with Devlin, standing quietly at the back of the room. No words were exchanged, but a simple nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd both taken. Walking out into the crisp evening air, Aubrey took a deep breath, feeling both exhausted and renewed. The fight wasn't over, it never would be, but for the first time in a long time, he knew that the fight was no longer his alone. Because change had already begun. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden glow over San Diego, its rays slipping through the glass windows of the city hall where a pivotal press conference was about to take place. The room was filled with a quiet hum of anticipation, journalists adjusting their cameras, community members sitting with expectant expressions, and officers lining the back wall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. At the center of it all stood Aubrey, ready to deliver a message that was more than just words. It was a call to action. Stepping up to the podium, Aubrey's gaze swept over the crowd. He didn't need prepared notes. The truth was etched into his very being, shaped by every moment of frustration, confrontation, and quiet reflection that had led him to this point. The room grew silent as he began to speak, his voice steady, carrying both the weight of past failures and the hope for future change. We often think silence is neutral, that by doing nothing we're avoiding conflict. But silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. His words hung in the air, sinking into the hearts of those listening. Aubrey continued, his voice gaining strength with each sentence. "I've seen what happens when people choose silence. I've seen how it allows abuse of power to grow unchecked, hidden beneath the surface of normalcy. But real authority isn't about control, it's about accountability. A badge doesn't make you better than anyone else, it makes you responsible to everyone." There was a shift in the room, a subtle, almost imperceptible change. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, listening more closely. The community members sat in rapt attention, their faces reflecting a mix of validation and cautious optimism. Aubrey paused, letting the weight of his words settle before he continued. "Justice isn't just about punishing the bad. It's about having the courage to admit when we're part of the problem and the integrity to change it. Change doesn't start with sweeping reforms or grand gestures. It starts with small actions, with one person daring to say, 'This isn't right.'" He glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with familiar faces, some supportive, some critical, but all listening. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the raw emotion of speaking a truth that had been buried for too long. "Buddy, I'm not standing here as a hero. I'm standing here as someone who refused to stay silent, and I hope that after today, I won't be the only one." The room was quiet for a beat. Then came the applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was genuine. A ripple of acknowledgement passed through the crowd, not just for Aubrey's words, but for the uncomfortable truths they carried. As Aubrey stepped down from the podium, he locked eyes with Chief Devlin, standing in the back. There was no need for words. Just a simple nod exchanged between them, a silent acknowledgement of the difficult path they'd walked and the work still ahead. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city. Aubrey stood for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. The fight for change wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time, he felt that the fight was no longer his alone. Because change had begun, and once it starts, it can't be stopped. In today's world, silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it's complicity. We often believe that small actions can't change anything, but every voice that speaks up, every act of courage to confront the truth is a building block for change. Justice isn't confined to courtrooms. It exists in the choices we make every day, whether to speak out or stay silent, to stand up or look the other way. Real change begins with the courage of individuals who refuse to ignore what's wrong and believe that even the smallest actions can create a ripple effect for a better future.